The sun sagged low over the wooden roofs of the town, pouring a rust-red glow across dust that never seemed to settle. The day had ended, but the air was still restless, humming with the quiet voices of people who lingered on porches and leaned against fence posts. In the center of it all stood a young woman, no more than 22, her hands folded before her like she was holding herself together. Her dress, once meant for Sundays, had faded to a weary shade of brown. It clung to her frame, thin from months of half-empty meals, from nights when she had no appetite for more than sorrow. Her husband, a man near 50, heavy with years of drink and bitterness, stood a few feet away. He spoke in a voice that carried more to the crowd than to her, a voice meant to humiliate. He declared her useless, cursed, barren, as though the words themselves were proof enough. The people listened, some shifting uneasily, others too eager for spectacle, but none stepped forward. Their silence was its own verdict. The young woman's eyes did not rise to meet theirs. She looked instead at the horizon beyond the rooftops, the sweep of land that promised escape but offered no comfort. She had once dreamed of that horizon when she was newly married, when she believed in the strength of promises and in the possibility of a gentle life. Back then, she had hoped her husband's age might mean steadiness, that his hands, worn by ranch work, might shelter her. But with each child that never came, his warmth drained like water from a cracked cup. His voice turned sharp, his patience thinner than the whiskey he drank. By the time the 4th year ended, he spoke of her not as wife, but as burden. The town had long known his temper, but the moment when he called her worthless before them all was the one that sealed her fate. He announced that he would sell her off as if she were cattle or a mule too stubborn to work. No one laughed. No one stopped him. A hush fell, broken only by the clink of a coin purse exchanged into his thick palm. She did not see who gave it, nor did she care. What mattered was the knowledge that she had been measured, appraised, and traded. She did not weep. She had no tears left for him, and no dignity left to salvage in that square. Instead, she lifted her chin the faintest degree, a gesture so slight it might have been missed by all but herself. It was not defiance, not pride, it was survival. She would not collapse here. The man who had been her husband spat into the dust, as if to rid himself of her memory. He muttered something about a curse on his bloodline, how God had closed her womb, and how no man could bear such shame. He turned his back, walking into the saloon with the same swagger he had carried when he first claimed her. She watched him disappear through the swinging doors, swallowed up by laughter and the smell of liquor, as though 4 years of her life had been nothing more than a shadow trailing him into the dark. The townsfolk scattered slowly. A few women whispered among themselves, their faces touched with sympathy but too fearful to show it outright. A couple of men shook their heads, muttering that no good comes from meddling in another man's business. Only an old widow with a crooked spine and eyes gone watery with age dared step close. She pressed a hand, light as a falling leaf, to the young woman's arm. With a voice hoarse from years, she said a single word, "Mercy," and then hobbled away, leaving the young woman with the echo of it. Night drew its shawl across the town. Lanterns lit in windows, shutters closed against the cool wind. The square emptied until she stood alone, dust clinging to the hem of her dress. She reached for her left hand, finding the finger bare, the ring already taken as if it had never belonged. She rubbed the skin where the band had once rested, a pale circle that now looked more like a scar than a memory. She thought of the house she could not return to, of the bed that had grown colder even when it was shared, of the silence that had become heavier than words. She thought of how he had looked at her the morning after their wedding, when she was still a girl trying to be a wife, and how that look had turned into something hollow over time. There had been days she had prayed for his kindness to return, and nights she had begged heaven for a child that never came. Each unanswered prayer built the wall that finally trapped her here, standing in the open as if she were less than human. A horse snorted from the hitching post nearby, breaking her thoughts. The animal pawed the ground impatiently, as though sensing the tension in the air. She stepped toward it, her fingers brushing its mane. For a moment she considered riding, vanishing into the plains where no one knew her name. Yet she had no coin, no kin to seek, no map to guide her. The horizon promised freedom, but it was also a wilderness that could devour her whole. She lifted her face to the sky, where stars had begun to puncture the dusk. They glittered like tiny candles in a ceiling too far to reach. Her lips moved in a whisper, not quite prayer, not quite curse. She asked nothing and promised nothing. She only let the night carry her words away, like seeds cast into soil that may never yield. The sound of laughter drifted from the saloon, rough and unkind. She knew his voice among them, thick with drink, boasting of silver won not from labor, but from her shame. She turned from the noise, from the lights, from the whole town that had watched her stripped of belonging. Her steps carried her slowly down the dirt road, away from the square, away from the eyes that had witnessed her undoing. The wind grew colder. Dust lifted around her ankles like the ghosts of all the women who had walked this same road before her, unseen and unheard. Each step felt heavier, yet also strangely lighter, as if she was leaving behind chains she had not realized were wrapped around her. By the time she reached the edge of town, the buildings were only shadows behind her. The open land stretched wide and uncertain before her. She paused, hugging her thin bundle of belongings close. For the first time in years, there was no one to command her, no roof to bind her, no vow to hold her. It was a terrifying freedom, raw and endless, like the plains themselves. She breathed deeply, letting the air fill her lungs. In that moment she knew two things. She had been sold as though her worth were measured in coin, but she would not live as though that were true. And though she did not yet know where her steps would lead, she understood that walking forward was the only choice left. Behind her, the town settled into silence. Before her, the horizon waited, vast, merciless, and filled with the faintest whisper of promise. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped into it, each stride carrying her farther from the life that had ended in the dust. Some women are abandoned with words, others with silence. She had been abandoned with a sail. And though her heart trembled at what lay ahead, she carried within her a spark too small to see but too stubborn to die. She walked on, not knowing that beyond the stretch of land, in the quiet watch of another soul, her story had only just begun. The road carried her like a forgotten thread unraveling from the town's edge, each step loosening what little remained of her old life. Dust rose faintly with her tread, catching the glow of dawn as it stretched pale across the horizon. She had walked most of the night, driven not by direction but by the need to put distance between herself and the square where her worth had been reduced to silver. Her bundle of belongings weighed little, yet her shoulders ached as though she bore the memory of every word spoken against her. When the sky softened to morning, she came upon a lonely water pump beside the road, its iron handle slick with dew. She bent to draw water, her arms weak, the creak of metal loud against the silence. Her reflection trembled in the bucket, eyes hollow, face streaked with dust, hair tangled by wind. She studied it as though it belonged to someone else. She touched the rim with her fingertips, feeling the coldness seep into her skin. It was then she heard the sound of hooves, slow and steady. A rider emerged from the bend in the road, a man not much older than 30, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low against the rising sun. His horse moved with the kind of patience that comes from long roads and longer silences. He slowed when he saw her, but did not call out. Instead, he dismounted, leading the animal closer with the quiet ease of one who lived more with land and beasts than with people. She stiffened, her grip on the bucket tightening. Men's eyes had long been a mirror of judgment, weighing, claiming, discarding. She expected the same in his, yet when he finally looked at her, there was no hunger, no pity, no smirk of superiority. His gaze was steady, the kind that did not press but waited, as if to say he had time to see her as she chose to be seen. He tipped his hat slightly, not a flourish but a gesture of respect, then crouched by the pump to let his horse drink. The animal lapped noisily, splashing water onto the dry earth. She watched him, uncertain, ready to turn away if he spoke carelessly. But he did not fill the air with questions or remarks. He simply stood when the horse had its fill, wiping his hands against his trousers, then reached into his saddlebag to offer her a small strip of dried meat. Her stomach tightened with hunger, yet pride held her back. She shook her head once, though her eyes lingered on the food. He set it down on the edge of the pump without insistence, as though leaving it for the wind to decide. The silence between them stretched, not heavy but waiting, like a pause in a song. She finally reached for it, and the first bite nearly broke her resolve to remain guarded. He did not smile at her acceptance, only nodded slightly, as if acknowledging an agreement neither had spoken. They walked together along the road after that, not side by side but near enough that the rhythm of his horse's hooves blended with the sound of her footsteps. She did not ask where he was headed, and he did not ask where she had come from. It was an unspoken truce, a shelter built of silence. By midday they reached a fork in the land where fields stretched out, dotted with cattle grazing beneath the wide sky. He paused there, gesturing with a tilt of his head toward a weathered cabin in the distance, its roof patched, smoke trailing faintly from a crooked chimney. His voice, when he finally used it, was low and unhurried. He told her she could rest there if she wished. Nothing more. She considered the offer, weighing trust against necessity. The town behind her held only shame, the road ahead offered only exhaustion. The cabin, though unfamiliar, carried the promise of shade, water, and a night without walking. She gave a single nod, and he led the way. The cabin was modest, its wood gray with years of sun and rain. A small corral stood nearby, chickens scratching in the dirt. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and earth. He set down his gear, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who lived alone and was used to his own company. She lingered near the door, uncertain of her place. He broke the silence by placing a cup of water on the table for her, then stepping back as though to give her space. She sat slowly, hands trembling faintly as she lifted the cup. The coolness steadied her, though her heart raced with the strangeness of being in a stranger's home. Through the afternoon she found herself helping with small tasks, gathering eggs, feeding the chickens, sweeping the floor. He did not direct her, but when he saw her working, he allowed it without comment, as if she had always been there. They spoke little, exchanging only a handful of words about the land, the weather, the animals. Yet within the silence lay something she had not known in years: safety. That evening they sat near the fire, the warmth softening the chill that crept from the plains. She kept her eyes on the flames, watching how they bent and danced. At last, words slipped from her lips, low and uncertain. She confessed that she felt hollow, like a tree stripped of fruit, standing only because the roots would not give way. The words surprised her, but once spoken they could not be gathered back. He did not interrupt. He stared into the fire, his face lit in amber, his hands resting still on his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but certain. "Even hollow trees," he said, "hold birds, give shade, and stand through storms." His words fell like rain on parched ground, not curing but easing. She looked at him then, really looked, and found no mockery in his expression, only calm truth. The fire burned low. She lay that night on a bed of blankets he arranged for her near the hearth, listening to the sound of the wind pressing against the cabin walls. For the first time in longer than she could remember, her body loosened into sleep without fear that a harsh voice might wake her. Morning brought new light across the fields, touching the cabin's wood with gold. She rose early, drawn by the soft cluck of hens. He was already outside, mending a fence. She watched him work, his movements steady, unhurried, like a man who knew time was not something to be conquered but walked alongside. She picked up a pail and moved to the well, drawing water without thinking whether she was permitted. When she carried it toward him, he accepted it with a nod, their eyes meeting briefly. Something passed between them, unspoken acknowledgement, a small bond born not of promises but of simple presence. By midday, neighbors arrived, a woman with children, cautious in her greeting, and a ranch hand who offered to trade supplies. Their eyes flicked toward her, measuring, questioning. She felt the weight of their doubt, the shadow of her past trailing her even here. But the man did not explain her presence, nor did he hide it. He introduced her plainly, without title or story, as though she needed no defense. When the visitors left, she lingered at the cabin door, staring across the fields that stretched without end. For the first time, she wondered if this place, with its quiet and its unspoken acceptance, could be something more than a pause on her journey. She felt the stir of a possibility too fragile to name, a possibility that frightened her as much as it steadied her. The evening fell again, bringing with it the hush of crickets and the glow of another fire. She sat across from him, words caught in her throat, unsure if silence was enough or if it left too much unsaid. His presence was not the kind that pressed for answers. He simply was, steady and unchanging, a figure both foreign and strangely familiar. Spring washed across the land like a blessing, softening the hard edges of winter and laying down a quilt of green across the field. Rain had fallen the night before, and the earth still breathed with the scent of it, fresh and damp. The cabin, weathered though it was, glistened faintly where drops clung to its wooden seams. She stepped outside barefoot, letting the cool mud squeeze between her toes, her face tilted to the lingering drizzle. For the first time in years, she felt no shame in being caught by the rain. Life in the cabin had settled into a rhythm, quiet but steady. She rose with the sun, often to find him already outside, hammering fence posts into stubborn earth or checking on cattle that grazed along the ridge. She cooked simple meals, mended worn shirts, gathered eggs, and fed the chickens, tasks that filled her hands even as her heart remained cautious. He never asked her to do these things, never expected it, but when she offered her labor, he accepted with a nod, his silence more comforting than words could have been. There were moments when she caught herself laughing, brief, startled sounds that slipped out before she could stop them. Once, as she collected eggs, a hen flapped indignantly and startled her so badly she nearly dropped the basket. He glanced up from his work at the fence, and though his face did not break into a smile, his eyes softened in a way that warmed her cheeks more than sunlight could. She had not realized how much she missed being seen without mockery. Evenings became their truest hours. They often sat together by the fire, not speaking, just listening to the pop of wood and the far-off cry of coyotes. Sometimes she sewed while he whittled wood into small shapes, simple figures that rested on the shelf when finished. Their silences were not empty. They brimmed with an unspoken language, a trust that grew in the spaces between words. Yet whispers of the world beyond the cabin crept in. When they went into town for supplies, she felt the sting of eyes upon her. Women turned away, men muttered as if her presence alone was a reminder of something unspeakable. Some called her cursed, others pitied her as a wife discarded like broken furniture. She held her head as high as she could, though inside she trembled. He walked beside her, steady, not shielding her, not proclaiming her, but existing as though their companionship needed no justification. It was during one such visit that her past came crashing back into the present. She had just stepped out of the general store when she heard a voice she thought she had left behind. Rough, thick with liquor, it carved through the air and froze her where she stood. Her former husband, heavier now, his face lined not by age but by bitterness, lurched across the street. His eyes found her, and they lit with cruel satisfaction. He laughed, loud enough for the bystanders to hear, and spat his words like venom. He called her barren, worthless, cursed by God. He boasted that no man could want what he had thrown away. The townsfolk gathered, eager for spectacle, their silence once again more damning than their noise. She felt her body lock, her throat dry, shame pressing down like an iron yoke. Before she could move, the man beside her, this stranger who had taken her in without question, stepped forward. He did not raise his voice, did not draw his gun. He simply looked her former husband in the eye and said, steady as stone, that a man's cruelty was his own curse, not the burden of the one he sought to break. His words fell into the crowd like pebbles into water, rippling outward, silencing even the whispers. Her husband snarled, muttered threats, but the stranger's calm held like a wall he could not breach. At last, defeated not by fists but by dignity, the older man staggered away toward the saloon, leaving behind the stench of his scorn. She stood trembling, unsure whether to collapse or run, until she felt the faintest brush of the stranger's hand against her elbow, guiding her quietly back to the wagon. No words passed between them until the town was far behind. That night, in the safety of the cabin, she broke. Her voice cracked as she confessed her fear, that no matter how far she walked, she would always be the woman left unwanted, the woman others whispered about, the woman defined by what she could not give. Her eyes burned, and she could not meet his gaze, afraid of finding pity there. But when he finally spoke, his words came with a gentleness that steadied her heart. He told her that what is wanted is not always what is worthy, and that worth cannot be measured in children, in coins, or in a husband's pride. He said she was more than the absence others had marked her with. She looked up then, and found no pity in his eyes, only quiet certainty, as if her very presence was proof enough of her value. In that moment something shifted inside her. The walls she had built around herself, thick with years of humiliation, cracked enough for light to seep in. She realized she was no longer merely surviving in his cabin, she was beginning to live again. Trust, tentative and fragile, had taken root. The days that followed were touched by a different kind of stillness. When she rose in the morning, she no longer felt the heaviness of being a burden. She carried her tasks with purpose, not as a debt but as a contribution. When he returned from the fields, she found herself waiting with supper warm on the stove, not because he demanded it, but because she wanted to. Their conversations grew a little longer, though still wrapped in the simplicity of plain words. Sometimes he told her of the land, of storms he had weathered, of cattle lost and found again. Sometimes she told him pieces of her childhood, the sound of her mother's lullabies, the way she used to run barefoot through fields without fear of what others thought. One evening, after a long day of mending fences, they sat on the porch together. The sky was awash with colors too grand to name, orange melting into violet, the first stars pricking through the fabric of dusk. She felt the urge to speak, to name what was growing between them, but her tongue faltered. Instead, she leaned her shoulder the slightest bit toward his, and when he did not move away, she allowed herself to breathe freely. The bloom of trust was not sudden, nor was it loud. It was quiet, like the slow opening of a flower beneath the sun, unnoticed until one day it stood fully awake. She found herself wanting to believe in the possibility of love again, though the word itself remained too heavy to speak. And yet, even in that fragile peace, shadows lingered at the edges. The memory of her husband's voice, sharp with cruelty, hung over her like a storm cloud. She knew pride such as his did not surrender easily. She knew his bitterness was not done with her yet. But for the first time, the thought did not hollow her entirely. She was no longer alone, no longer voiceless, and the man who stood beside her had already proven that dignity could be a weapon stronger than violence. The night deepened around them as they sat on the porch. Crickets sang, the stars multiplied, and the fields lay hushed beneath the sweep of the moon. She turned to him, ready to speak but not knowing what words could carry the weight of her gratitude, her fear, and her quiet, unspoken hope. What left her lips instead was simple. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not answer right away, only tilted his head as though listening to the night. Then, softly, he said there was nothing to thank him for. But she knew better. She knew that what he offered her, the gift of being seen without judgment, the gift of steady kindness, was more than she had ever dared hope for. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to believe in the fragile possibility of tomorrow. The storm arrived first as a distant growl, a low rumble rolling across the plains. The sky bruised purple and gray, heavy clouds gathering like a tide of anger waiting to break. She stood by the cabin window, fingers pressed to the glass, her heart uneasy though the fields outside lay still. He was near the corral, checking the latch, his figure steady against the restless wind. Something in the air warned her that this storm was not only of the sky. By the time thunder cracked overhead, riders appeared on the horizon, silhouettes bent low in their saddles. She recognized the lead figure before she wished to, her former husband, riding with two men at his side, their faces sharp with malice. Fear coiled in her stomach, but her breath steadied when she saw the stranger, the man who had taken her in, straighten and step forward with calm resolve. He rested one hand on the rail, the other loose at his side, a picture of quiet defiance. The riders thundered into the yard, mud flying from their horses' hooves. Her husband dismounted heavily, eyes gleaming with drink and rage. He shouted that she was his still, no matter the silver exchanged, no matter the distance she had put between them. His words spilled like venom into the rain-soaked earth, demanding her return as though she were a lost possession, a coin he had dropped and now wished to reclaim. She stepped out from the cabin then, rain plastering her hair to her face, her shawl clinging like a second skin. Her heart pounded, yet she forced herself forward, the mud sucking at her boots. She had been silent for too long. Her voice trembled at first, but it grew steadier as she spoke, telling him she was not his, not now, not ever again. She declared that no man owned her, not the one who had sold her, nor the one who had sheltered her. She was hers alone to choose, and she chose this life, this place, this steadiness. The men with her husband jeered, their hands twitching near their belts, but her words carried across the storm, stronger than she expected. The townsfolk had gathered at the fence line, drawn by the clash like moths to flame, their faces pale in the flickering light of lightning. They watched, waiting to see whether cruelty or dignity would prevail. Her husband's face twisted with fury, his pride wounded deeper than any blade could cut. He lunged forward, hand reaching for her arm, but the stranger stepped between them. He did not raise his weapon, though the other men's hands hovered near their holsters. He simply stood, rain running down his face, and told them the truth in a voice that did not waver, that she belonged to no man but herself, and any who tried to break that would find themselves broken instead. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the standoff. For a moment, time held still, the crackle of storm, the whisper of townsfolk, the trembling breath caught in her chest. Then the old husband, too blind with rage to see the futility, swung his arm, aiming not at her but at the man who shielded her. The motion startled his horse, rearing high with a panicked cry. The animal's hooves flailed, striking wildly, and in the chaos her husband stumbled, thrown into the mud with the weight of his own violence bearing him down. His companions hesitated, uncertain, their bravado withering in the storm's fury and in the stranger's unyielding gaze. The crowd did not move to help the fallen man. Their silence, once complicit, now turned against him. He had revealed himself fully, not as wronged husband, but as a man so consumed by pride that he had sold his wife and now sought to reclaim her as if she were cattle. In that instant, his power dissolved like salt in rainwater. He staggered to his feet, drenched, his threats drowned out by thunder and by the faces of those who would no longer follow his cruelty. With no weapon but his rage, he mounted his horse and fled, his men trailing after him, swallowed by the storm. Silence fell except for the steady patter of rain. She stood trembling, her body cold, her spirit burning. The stranger turned to her, his hand brushing against hers, not grasping, not claiming, only steadying. Their eyes met, and in his gaze she saw not triumph, not possession, but a deep, unwavering respect. The storm rolled farther off, its thunder a fading drumbeat, leaving only the soft hush of rain cleansing the land. The townsfolk drifted away, murmuring among themselves, their eyes different now, not mocking, not pitying, but thoughtful. They had witnessed something greater than scandal or spectacle. They had seen a woman reclaim her voice, and a man stand beside her without demanding her silence. When the last of the onlookers was gone, she and the stranger walked back toward the cabin, their hands brushing until at last they joined fully. No vows were spoken, no promises demanded. Yet the weight of their joined fingers said enough, that whatever came next, they would face it together, not as master and possession, not as savior and rescued, but as two souls who had found in each other a place to rest. The rain slowed, leaving the air fresh, the earth glistening with renewal. Dawn began to push its pale light through the thinning clouds, washing the cabin and the fields in gold. She looked at the horizon, no longer a line of exile but a stretch of possibility. The life she had been sold from was behind her. The life she could choose was ahead. Her voice, quiet but firm, rose into the morning air, speaking not to him alone but to the land, to herself, to whatever sky might be listening. She said she was no longer broken. She was no longer defined by what she could not give. She was worthy and she was free. The stranger's hand squeezed hers once, silent affirmation. Together they stepped inside as the last drops of rain slid from the roof, the fire within waiting to be lit. Sometimes storms do not destroy, they cleanse. Sometimes battles are not won with bullets, but with the courage to speak when silence has been your prison. And sometimes, against the vast and merciless plains, the rarest victory is not in being claimed but in being seen.